here.
Professor Wolff, what was your road to Damascus moment, coming to Marx, your Saul Paul moment?
Well, I think it was partly my family. My father and mother were refugees from Europe, came here to the United States to run away from World War II. And when I was born, my father was pushing a wheelbarrow in the Youngstown, Ohio sheet and tube steel company. He had been a lawyer in Europe, but when he came here, that counted for nothing. So he was lucky to get any job, and he got a job as a steel worker. And the rest of his life was the denial of being able to do what he had wanted to do. And I think, in one honest way, that shaped me to understand that the world can treat you really badly, and you have to try to understand that. And if you can think about it, when I used to talk with my father and ask him, what do you think about what's going on? He kind of tutored me in understanding that if the world had been organized differently, there wouldn't have been Nazis, and there wouldn't have been war, and there wouldn't have been refugees, and there wouldn't have been. And I could see, I couldn't put into words then, but I could see that the way he got through the traumas of his life was by understanding. Telling a story to explain why it happened was almost a kind of therapy for him, almost a way of coping.
And did he talk about these in explicitly political terms?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, he did. And I think he came to politics because he needed to explain this. Mm-hmm. For example, his sister died in Auschwitz, okay? That's a problem. You got to cope with what does that mean? Picked up off a street of Paris and whisked off and never saw her again. He had to come to terms. And the way he did that, to deal with that horror, how do you do that? He used his head. He told the story. He made an explanation. And I think I'm a teacher in part because making an explanation, I could see in my father, was his way of coping with life. So part of my coming to Marx was I began to ask the question, why is the society work the way it does? I did it in high school. I continued in college. I certainly wasn't a Marxist then, or anything like it.
Did you study economics in college?
No, I took one. As a freshman, I took one course in economics. I thought this was the dumbest nonsense I had ever heard. I couldn't believe the teacher. I thought it was a joke, and I was waiting for the punchline, but it never came. It was all these lines and graphs. I had been a mathematics student, so I wasn't intimidated by the lines and the graphs. But this was childish, what was being said here. It made no sense at all. So I never took another course in college in economics. I kept away from it like it was a disease. I didn't want to go anywhere near there. I majored in history because I could study. History's everything.
Well, history's a story.
That's right. It's the story. That's right. And I could and history is economic history and political history and cultural history. You can do whatever you want. That was exactly what I wanted to study. But the more I studied, the more I understood. If you don't understand what's going on in the economy, you're missing a major part of the story. And my teachers didn't deal with it. They didn't handle it. So I'm a little bit also shaped, my Damascus, by the kid who can't get the cookies out of the jar. They become very attractive if you can't get them. So if the teachers are avoiding the economic story, they're avoiding the conflict between employers and employees, masters, slaves, lords, serfs, if all of that is kind of swept under the rug, which it was when I was going to school, then it became even more interesting for me. Why am I being kept from this? Why am I not being told about this? And I had enough people I could ask who gave me a book to read or an article to read, and I began to figure out, toward the end of college, that we were not being taught what was the most important and interesting stuff. And once you're into that, you find Marx. Sooner or later, you find Marx.
And then once you sort of walk through that door and that in your mind, the missing part of that story falls into place, what was it? What was missing, and then what was articulated by coming to Marx that excited you or interested you?
The basic thing was, that what goes on in the economy, how people make a living, is a crucial part of who they are, what they think about, how they relate to other people. And within that, there's a crucial part which has to do with conflict between the employer and the employee. Yeah. and all of that. And I wasn't being told anything. I was actually being told that there's a wonderful, perfect arrangement in which the interests of the worker and the interests of the employer are the same, and they're working together, and they're all getting a fair cut of what they do together. It's a happy, happy story. This made no sense to me at all.
Yeah, especially since you're reading history and it's all this array of violent conflict, and you're, well, what are they fighting over?
Yes, and if it's all so wonderfully worked out, why did all this conflict happen? What, are they all stupid? They didn't get it?
Yeah.
You know, they make no sense to me. It really, at a certain point, I realized I had to do this on my own. I had to go read this stuff and find it, which I did. I wasn't the only one. I had other students who did it with me. But, you know, and I'm a poster boy for elite education in this country. The college I went to where I didn't get what I should have is called Harvard.
Huh.
And when I finished, I got my PhD at Yale. I mean, it's like a joke.
Yeah.
You know, I am the product of all of that. So, you know, I went to the schools that claimed to give me the best possible blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And they were terrible in this regard. They were frightened. You know, it was the Cold War. I went to school in the 60s, 70s, 80s. It's a time when Americans were scared shitless about the evil empire of the Soviet Union. That was associated with Marxism. And the American response really was to make believe it wasn't there. At least in the schools. It was so evil that you wouldn't gonna get near it, wouldn't talk about it, wouldn't teach it. So I'm part of a generation that has no idea what all of that's about. It's so evil that you never, ever get anybody to teach you anything other than how and why to dismiss it, how and why to say it's silly or it's wrong or it's bad. It's really childish. More than bad politics, it's childish, fearful education. You're afraid to talk to the students. You know, I used to say to my teachers, you know, even if you don't like it, the biggest country in the world by population is China, and the biggest country in the world by geography is Russia. Those two countries take this stuff seriously. That's enough of a reason for you to teach it. People are going to have to deal with those folks, so why don't we understand how they see the world? I mean, come on, what? This isn't rocket science. This ought to be part of the curriculum. They had no answer for me, and I could read in their faces. They were just scared. Later, I discovered I was right. They were scared. It wasn't hard to figure out. Your career was over. If you expressed, even in my earlier career, you expressed interest in Marxism and the critique of capitalism, people looked at you as if you had an STD. They important to keep a good distance, or you had the flu or something really bad. And don't hire you, don't give you a job.
You need some sort of academic and professional prophylactic as well to keep it from spreading.
Exactly, to keep the whole thing from getting out of hand. And we don't want one of those. I've always had jobs as an academic. I've been a professor all my life. But that's because of another quality of the United States, which is deference to things like Harvard and Yale. I get a job despite my politics because I got a pedigree. And that pedigree in academia counts for a lot. So that's the only use I have for it. I didn't get a very good education, but it's very useful to wave the pedigree whenever I get myself into difficulty. It has served me nicely, and I appreciate it for that reason. But the education, no.
We've been talking to you a little bit about how you sort of came to understand Marx and this sort of this missing piece of your education that was filled in by Marxism and sort of an understanding of the world that was different from what you had been taught. But I want to go back now to where this all began, at least as it regards you coming on our show. Professor Wolff, what does the film Boss Baby tell us about contemporary capitalist ideology?
Well, it tells me many things. It tells me that underneath the pretense that everything is working out really pretty well, there's a pretty good understanding, as in that movie, that there's a lot of bitterness, a lot of nastiness, a lot of struggle, a lot of weird kinds of belief that are widely shared. For me, the best moment in that film comes early, when the bad new baby, having arrived, explains to the older sibling, who's not quite understanding what's going on, he leans across and he says, there's just not enough love for both of us. You remember that?
Yeah.
He actually has a theory. It's got to be a fight to the death between the two little ones because there's not enough. That's what American working people are doing. There's not enough money to give you a decent life. So you have to have debts up the wazoo to send your kid to college. You have to do without. You have to, because there's just not enough. It's bullshit in the movie and everyone sees it. And it's bullshit in the economics too, although people don't see it yet. That's my job, is how to help people see that there's no problem with amount of money and none of that. Never was. It's only a question of how you go about using it and dividing it and making it work. If you don't want to, yeah, you can give it all to a few people and everybody else is in trouble. But there's no necessity. That's not necessary. That's not built into anything. That's a political struggle, and you either fight it and win or you live with resignation. And that's been the lot of people for a long time. So for me, the movie was interesting because it captured the crazy ideology and showed how it shaped the lives of those two little ones because of the fury of the older one being displaced and the fury of the younger one wanting to be the displacer and needing an ideological story to tell to make it all sound reasonable and necessary when it wasn't.
Also interesting that the Boss Baby, voiced by Alec Baldwin, who famously gave voice to, I think, one of the greatest expressions of capitalist domination and sadism in Glengarry Glen Ross.
Which is referenced in Boss Baby when he says, "Put the cookie down, cookies are for closers," which was a huge hit with all the 8-year-olds who saw that movie.
But is a movie like predicated on like the anxieties around scarcity and competition?
Right.
It is kind of interesting that they're like, okay, well, at the end, he does not defeat the baby. He unifies with the baby, and there's solidarity with him and the baby to overthrow the Boss Baby bureaucracy, if you will.
Yeah, that's the thing that sticks with me is how it presents capitalism as like generative. It's like capitalism is inextricable. You can't get away from it.
Right.
Like it exists before you're born.
Right.
Like
you're born into it.
Yeah, there's a factory with machinery and bosses in the place where babies are made, and then even the way that it imagines like reproduction, like it's the conflict between the babies and the puppies, because in the world of Boss Baby, you only have a kid if you want one, and then like the factory makes a baby for you. So they're literally creating need. It's like they're saying that they're not satisfying needs for children or anything. They're creating them. You need to go down to earth to make people want to have the kids. So everything is just in this web of production for its own sake, and the need to create demand for things that aren't necessarily necessary. And that's sort of the generative structure of everything is you need people to consume. And you need to, if there isn't enough, if they don't need enough, then you make them want something, and then you provide that for them.
I would use it to teach the economics of advertising, because that's what that is.
Yeah.
The company, to make money, has to dump the stuff it's produced. It has to have buyers. If the buyers don't want it, don't need it, don't like it, you've got to fix that. And the way you fix it, if you can, is by inundating them with the advertising, playing on their psychological problems to get them to part with their money and buy the damn thing you've produced. That's why in economics it is so crazy when we teach in conventional economics that production happens in response to consumption. The craziness is to assume that consumption is a given. This comes out of your soul and has nothing to do with what? With what you see every day on every billboard, I came here on the subway. To get through the subway turnstile, I had to read the advertisements on the subway's turnstile. Every minute, we all know that, we're inundated with people spending fortunes of money to shape our desires. But in the economics textbook of the classroom, production is a wonderful arrangement because it meets our needs, almost as if we need to pretend that the producers are not spending big bucks to shape our needs at every chance they get.
Yeah, to go on that, to more in this contrast between the world that exists in an economics textbook and an economics classroom, and the world that actually exists where we see the movie Boss Baby, and even though we can't quite put our finger on it, we identify with the figure of a tyrannical infant. But how does, like, just generally speaking, like, how does the broadly understood, like when people talk about economics or the economy, how does your understanding of that differ from what is overwhelmingly taught in schools and for what, like, most people, when they think of it, what the idea that's in their head?
Econ 101.
Econ 101. Okay, there's a number of ways to get at this. I guess the biggest one for me was and still is that if you look around this society with more or less reasonable open-mindedness, you must see some things. For example, you know that there are some people that are very rich and some people that are very poor. Every community has them. Most Americans know exactly what part of the community they don't go in the evening because you don't go there in the evening. Their parents, when they were young, explained that to them one way or another. We know inequality, and if you're here in New York City, as I live, it is so overwhelmingly obvious every day that you really have to have a cultivated blindness not to see it. I'll give you another example. The instability. I mean, we're now living in the 10th year after a crash, 2008. Kind of everybody knows that. The headlines this week are full of stories that we might be about to have another crash. 75 years ago, we had the greatest crash this system ever had, the 1930s. I mean, crashes are part of it. I used to make a joke in my class that would help students understand. If your roommate was as unstable as this economic system, you would have moved out long ago. But you accept this. You kind of think it's necessary. It's somehow like the rain. You don't like it, but every few days it drops water. But an economic system isn't nature. It's something human beings organize. So for me, I would want economics to talk to me about the great difference between rich and poor. Adam Smith is the founder of this science. He wrote a famous book, The Wealth of Nations. He was interested why some nations are rich and why some are poor. That's me. I like that question. I would like it to be answered, and I would like it to be answered honestly. We have a system that produces enormous inequality. It always has. What about that? What about why does it happen? And then the logical question, could you have an economic system that didn't do that? In other words, let's talk about it, because that's not only interesting as a human being, but it's also very practical. If there could be an alternative that didn't do it, oh, well, why don't we go there? Or why don't we do that? These kinds of questions literally were never dealt with in my education. The fancy schools I went to, they didn't do that. In fact, most of the education and economics departments, where I got my education in economics, really had very little to do with understanding how an economy actually works, let alone what an alternative might be. They were mostly celebrations. We learned to be cheerleaders, that this capitalist system is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and here's the wonderful way it works, and then everybody stands up at the end and applauds, and those of us that go on to be college teachers are supposed to teach all that junk again. It's so bad, this sort of rationalization or cheerleading for the system, that even the business community in America understands it. Let me explain. Economics is one of the very few fields in American universities where almost every university has two economics departments, not one. The one that's called economics is all about celebrating how wonderful the system is. But over the years, the business community got angry, complained. It's very nice. We're glad that you think capitalism is great. So do we. But this is not useful. A young man or a young woman comes out of here knowing how wonderful it is, but they don't know how it works because you don't teach that. So we're going to set up another track, another economics department, which will be different. It won't be there to celebrate how wonderful it is. You do a good job at that. We're going to have another department that teaches people how it actually works. That's called a business school.
Yeah, and they're usually kept on opposite sides of the
campus. That's right. It's a nice long walk. They barely talk to each other. It's weird. You don't have two history departments. You don't have two English departments. You don't have two French departments. You don't have two biology departments. But you all have two economics departments. It's so silly that in some universities where they got budget problems, they just collapse the two together to avoid the need for double space and double faculty. But it's an admission that economics has been for a long time in this country a cheerleading section in which you teach cheerleading to future cheerleaders who will go around and tell you all of this. That's why, by the way, I mean, among the many costs of this arrangement is a generation of people who, when this system doesn't work well, don't know what to do. Look at it now. They don't know. They can't explain what is going on in the stock market. The explanations are ad hoc and are weird, and you kind of wonder if they understand it so well on Tuesday, how come they didn't think about it last Tuesday? You know what? Bizarre. But that's not really their fault. It's not that they're dumb or anything like that. There's been no education in what's wrong with capitalism. What are the flaws of this system? What alternatives could we have? Because that the Cold War made taboo. We're living in a country that is still just beginning to crawl out from under that taboo.
I think one of the most effective things about that Econ 101 understanding, which is really like the best example of like a little bit of knowledge can be a dangerous thing. We were like talking earlier, it gives you just enough information to remain stupid. But it is very successful because it presents these things, I think like you said a little bit earlier, as natural. That these are just law, like supply and demand, that these are laws like gravity or evolution or things like that our economy is a natural expression of human nature.
Well, whenever there was, this is going backward, but there was a hiring of a few, not even what you would consider like far less left economists, but like lefter economists than the norm at Indiana University. And as a result, the business school started to create its own classes, economics for business majors. So even if you wanted to learn about economics, you could completely circumvent the economics department completely.
Yeah, the ideology in this country has been very, very strong. And the naturalization, the way you put it, is exactly right. To teach people this is the way the human nature works. Any effort to make it better goes against human nature. When my students raise that, which they always do, I try to tell them stories. I said, when there was slavery in many parts of the world, people were told that it's just natural. Some people are master-type people, and other people are slave-type people. Slaves are sort of like children, and you wouldn't want to let the children run the chicken coop, and so they're children, and they wait till they grow up. The problem with slaves is children always, and that was thought to be human nature, and people justified what they were doing on the grounds that we have to take care of these poor slaves because they're not really fully human. But it was always natural. In the Middle Ages, it was natural to be a serf or a lord. In our days, it's natural to be an employer or an employee or any one of the other dichotomies you want. People always who don't want change, who either are afraid of change or can't imagine it, make themselves feel better by saying, well, this is the end of the process of change because we're finally in tune with nature. But you can only believe that if you don't know that every prior system, however different from yours, also thought it was in tune with nature, which once you get it, makes it disappear as a rationale.